away, and yet he's still teaching part-time here online. So he has two courses, and that will continue next semester. So he's only half here, if that makes sense. And one of our other faculty members, Dr. Terry, that's Joel Potter, and Terry Kelly is right now constantly sending pictures of Spain on my Facebook so that I get to see how well his son is doing in the soccer school that they went there to Barcelona for him to play soccer and learn how to be. He's a teenager, so. But meanwhile, the two of them are enjoying Spain, and they're living in an apartment and everything. So whenever we email him, all we get is this automatic response that says, "I'm not here." But then we have Stephanie, who's our current chair, because Terry's away, although she's been chair before. Her specialty, Stephanie Bauer. This is kind of dumb. So there's Dr. Potter, there's Stephanie, John is here, so he's teaching. He's an Aristotelian specialist and logic specialist. We have Dr. Raymond Anthony, who is our ecological ethics specialist. There's Dr. Kelly. And then we have Gunnar, who's working on a PhD, and he teaches the same kind of courses that I do, because notice I just have a master's myself. That's me, believe it or not, when I was younger. All the pictures I have are of me when I was younger. Okay. So that's us. That's our department. We've got some emeriti who, they're not with us anymore. They're still alive, but nonetheless, they're completely away from here.
Do you have one you recommend for a logic guy? Who's the most logical?
I taught logic this semester, but I don't think that's going to come up again. I mean, they haven't asked me, but Gunnar usually teaches logic, but he does use primarily online tools, so it's very different than face-to-face. But or you could just move on to specific history courses. However, so that's our department. Thank you for asking. So today my focus should be on Wittgenstein and language games and Quine. And since we've really started already going over roughly Wittgenstein, we're working on the language games portion. I expect to spend most of today talking about Quine and neo-pragmatism. The term papers, notice, are due this week, hopefully. So don't forget about those. And then the third test is what I call the final, and so please send me that. Nothing is actually due physically, and I don't have blue books with people writing. Whenever I see people carrying piles of blue books back to their offices after the last day, I'm like, that's a shame. It's so much easier just having everything come in on email, because then I can use my word processor to check to see if the word count is good. If it is, you get an A, and then I read the paper. you know, so relax, you know. However, okay, so that's our schedule. And so, yeah, the class is scheduled to meet Wednesday. Not, I mean, we meet as usual today and this Wednesday, but next week we only meet on Wednesday. We don't have our Monday class.
Just
And
for this class, or is that the whole campus?
the whole campus should be on the finals week in finals week schedule, which means, and the reason for it is the idea is everybody has a 2-hour test where everybody comes in and they're standing in the hallways mumbling to themselves, trying to remember all the you know, the index cards so that they remember all the body parts and they remember all the vocabulary words, and you know, and then they come in and they're sitting there at the desk writing in their blue books for 2 hours, and then they go away to get ready for their next final somewhere else. And so you get a double session in the finals week for every class. And of course that means there's a scheduling headache because some people are going to have conflicts. But meanwhile, mostly everything is rearranged. That even means some rooms are rearranged so that you're not even meeting in the same place. But we're fine. We'll be meeting here for our last session. And since I basically have already requested you to send me your term paper and your tests, and I've actually already discussed everything on the 30 lecture syllabus, we could just talk about whatever the heck we feel like for that last session. Frankly, hardly anybody ever shows. I have to show. You know, that's my contract. I have to be here for the whole contact hours time. You don't, but you're certainly welcome to come. Sometimes people bring cookies. You know, it's kind of almost like a Christmas party, really. And then what I used to do was even show videos, and I'd come in with like 7 or 8 videos, philosophically oriented videos, and whoever came could vote on which video we would watch, and we would watch the video. We did homily occasionally. We did what the bleep do I know? You know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of fun ones to do. But when it turned out that hardly anybody used to come, plus everybody kind of got tired after about an hour, so we don't really even stay the whole extra session, I stopped doing that. So, but we could talk about all kinds of philosophical issues. Current issues are good. Okay, so that's our schedule coming up. When you start sending me your term papers and your test 3, I'm getting about 105 of them all at once, times 2, right? So despite my fantastic skills in reading and zipping through, you know, all this stuff and sending responses, I'll be slow once I get all that at once. So don't be surprised if it takes a while. My biggest worry, though, is that some folks forget the term paper. That's the biggest problem I have, is that at the end of the semester, some folks have totally blotted out the requirement for the term paper, which is 25% of the grade. So if I don't get the term paper, the highest grade you could get is a C. So please don't forget that. Etc. So there's some formatting issues. Some people send me things from that alien computer institution called Apple, you know, that have a format called Pages. Pages will not open on any of the devices I have. So please don't send me Pages content because you know, instead of Microsoft Word or even if you just send it in a HTML format, that works fine. In fact, that's how I save everything. Because, as they completely revamp word processors every few years, and then you can't open old documents with the new one, and you often end up with those kind of conflicts. I've never had that problem because I've always saved all the papers I receive in HTML format. So every change, they keep that. That's an important format. Everybody uses that. Okay, so let's take a look at unless you have questions about no, actually, let's not use much more. If you have questions about Ludwig Wittgenstein. So we were talking about the second of his philosophies. Analytic philosophy is the first associated with him, and the second was ordinary language analysis. The influences on Quine include the Sir Alfred North Whitehead, or Lord Alfred North Whitehead, who was the mentor for Bertrand Russell in his mathematical undergraduate days, and then they partnered together to write the Principia Mathematica. But then after that, Whitehead went to Harvard and was a professor there, and that's where Quine is influenced by him. And you'll notice that there's lots of associations with Quine. For example, Daniel Dennett, who just died recently, was a student of Quine. There are other Harvard colleagues like Hilary Putnam that are associated with him. I think they're pretty much all dying or dead now. So you could see Quine died in 2000, December of 2000. Let me get rid of this. December, Christmas Day in 2000. And by the way, of all the philosophers we've talked about, he's the one I've actually saw in person. So he came and gave a lecture at my alma mater, which was neat. Big, full, relatively small, special library on campus, but it was full, and I was up in the front and got to hear him lecture. And it even made it into his book. He published a biography, which is, I believe, the most boring biography I've ever read, and it's called The Time of My Life by Quine. And he mentions my alma mater and that particular lecture in half of a sentence, because he's talking about the one trip where he went to one college, comma, stopped by Westchester, comma, and then, so that was neat. We got into the book. He mentioned us. But the lecture he gave that I attended was fascinating. He was trying to explain to us what the main job of a mathematical logician was. So even though he's in the philosophy department, he's considered a mathematical logician. And most of his books are almost unreadable unless you're familiar with mathematical logic, because it's almost all in mathematical logic. There's a few books that you can read. And in fact, we'll look at one of the articles that's online, even though it's still, I think, still barely copyright material because of, you know, how long that works and everything. And that's two dogmas of empiricism we'll look at. But the lecture he gave, what is the main job of a mathematical logician today? And he said that the poor scientists, the physicists mostly, that we have, are at a breaking point where the things that they're discovering in their laboratories, their studies, are not expressible in ordinary language. And the problem is that they don't have a subject anymore. A subject, like, you know, this is a magic marker, you know, subject of a sentence. English needs a subject and a predicate. It's kind of like Greek that way. You know, all the Western European languages tend to be kind of following that Greek template, which is not universal, by the way. As I think I've expressed before, that certain Asian languages don't seem to have the verb to be, and as a result, you can't do statements like all S is P, no S is P, some S is P, some S is not P, right? And literally, you can't do those sentences in some languages. And remember, the problem is that for us, a true or false statement is a statement that is organized that way, that this whatever you want to call it, this subject or this content or this set of things, if we talk about it as set theory, this set is included in this set is excluded from this set, this set has some members that are included in this set, and this set has some members that are not included in this set. And that's what gives us the idea of a correspondence theory of truth. This statement is true, and I can say, yes, you said that this chair is green, and yes, it is. All the chairs in this room are green. Yes, they are, I think. Oh, no, that one isn't. Okay, so that was false. And you can tell because it turned out that not all of the chairs in the room were green. Well, so we're using a particular grammatical structure that we see what we're doing is relating two sets of things. Well, if you have a language that doesn't have the verb to be, you literally can't format statements in such a way that you're relating two sets of things. Which means, strictly speaking, there's no true or false statement in those kinds of languages as we use them. So it's very confusing because obviously those languages are very successful. Think about Chinese, for example. There are more people that speak Chinese than speak English, and yet and they're obviously successful in many things. So they have a way of understanding what we would think of as true or false. But how does it work? There's lots of folks that are actually trying to figure that out, actually. But here the physicists, since really the beginning of quantum physics has reached a point where even though in everyday life we talk about objects, when the physicists are talking about the things they're studying, they no longer have objects. Instead, they have energy in an arrangement. And the energy in an arrangement is essentially a predicate. So you don't actually have typical English sentences. Instead, they have relationships between groups of predicates. And when we talk about those groups of predicates, we haven't yet settled on the best way to do that. We haven't figured out, well, what do we want to call these groups? Because they're not objects in the typical old-fashioned sense. Instead, they're constantly in process, right? And as a result of that, we feel like we're wrong to say, for example, that I have a persistent self. Well, the government will insist on it, because my Social Security a number, is mine, they tax me, that based on, I've got a record of all my, failings and other accomplishments, etc. And that seems pretty clear to indicate that I have a persistent self, at least for governmental purposes. But at the same time, when we talk about what am I, remember how we get into this dialectical process between my in itself and my for itself, or whatever you want to think of as this constant process, that I can't really identify myself as this. Remember Jean-Paul Sartre refers to the neat French expression, I am what I am not, and I am not what I am. And as a result, there's a gap between the in itself and the for itself, and that gap is nothingness. And nothingness is how negation enters into being, coiled in the heart of being like a worm. Sartre is weird that way.
Wait, would you say that one more time? From the nothingness. We go back to nothingness and go from there. The worm part, I thought.
Yeah, well, we could go to the master himself, actually. Sartre being is coiled in the heart of being, capital B, like a worm. Let's see if I quoted that. So my memory is still working fairly well, at least in some things. But that nothingness is human nature for Sartre. And his explanation of why we have free will and free choice is because while science says everything has this cause and effect relationship with everything else, we have this gap, this nothingness coiled in our beings where we can say no, or in French, non, right? If you like. So we can literally, with our consciousness, break the chain of causality. Because from our terrible twos on, we can say no. And so I remember being kind of thrilled with that, thinking, yeah, we are free, aren't we? When you read these guys. But the problem, of course, is that this is a persistent state of affairs for what we think of as ourself, because while you're conscious, it doesn't work while you're asleep for some reason, but while you're conscious, the self is constantly going through this dialectical process. That's in a sense what consciousness is, especially that part of us what we think of as self-consciousness, right? In that sense, there is no persistent self that we think of. That's really us. And in a sense, that's the same way for every particle, is that it's going through this kind of constant process. Quarks are not really, I mean, literally, we talk about atoms as material, and subatomic, you're no longer talking about material anymore. The subatomic particles that make up an atom are not matter. They're energy, right? And so you get, instead of matter and spirit, now we have mass and energy. So we still have a dichotomy, but what is mass? Mass, remember, E equals C squared. What does that mean? It means that literally mass can become energy in a certain state. And if that's the case, then it's not like we really have a pure dichotomy between matter and energy. Instead, matter is energy in a particular arrangement. That means there is no specific object that persists over time. even though in everyday life, of course, we can certainly rely on objects persisting for a lifetime or more. Right? I mean, ancient objects, that we find, mummies and things, we can do a DNA study on the mummy and find out that she died of tuberculosis. No, actually, DNA wouldn't have helped that. I don't know how to do it. But in any case, for a physicist, we no longer have objects, and so they needed a new language that they could use in physics in order to talk about what they were talking about and to express what they were discovering. And that's why we end up with predicate logic. Everything is made up of predicates and with certain characteristics. And this was, in a sense, a characteristic of language that Bertrand Russell was already working on, so that we ended up with if I do this, let me go to the square of opposition. We already have it here. Traditional. This is the page I kept referring to earlier, even when I was talking about Aristotle. Here's those 4 statement types that we could use to make true or false statements. Remember, we can make compound statements that are compound because you have more than one of these making up the statement. I can have every S is P and every Q is R. And that's a compound statement, but it's made up of 2 primary statements or two basic statements.
If somebody from an Eastern culture, would they have a harder time understanding this since they don't really have that?
It's an interesting question, because I have found that in logic class that we have students. I forget how many languages we have in Anchorage now. It keeps growing, but I've had folks in class whose native language was different than a European language, and might even be still, certainly would be considered a English as a second language ESL student, but nonetheless we're taking college